The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the windshield as Emily gripped the steering wheel. The narrow mountain road twisted ahead like a serpent, its curves barely visible under the faint glow of her headlights. Midnight was moments away, and the storm seemed to grow darker with every passing second. Her knuckles whitened as the tires skidded slightly on the slick asphalt. She hadn't wanted to drive tonight, not in weather like this. But something deep inside, something she couldn't explain, had drawn her out here. The air felt heavy, charged with an eerie stillness that the rain couldn't mask. Emily had never believed in ghosts. Growing up, she scoffed at her friends' tales of haunted houses and lingering spirits, waving them off as childish fantasy. Her life was grounded in reality, in the predictable routine of work, friends, and family. But this belief would change one fateful night, with a single phone call. It was a cold November evening, and Emily was home alone, curled up on the couch with a book and a cup of tea. Outside, rain poured down, rattling against the windows as if the wind was desperate to come inside. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. She had work the next day, and it was about time to turn in. Just as she set down her tea, her phone rang. The number was unlisted. A shiver ran down her spine. She rarely received calls at this hour. Her first instinct was to let it ring out, but curiosity got the better of her. She picked up, bringing the phone to her ear. "Hello?" At first, there was silence. Then, a whisper. "Emily." The voice was faint, barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. "It's me." Her blood turned cold. She knew that voice. It belonged to someone who couldn't be calling her. Jake had died nearly a year ago in a car accident. The love of her life, gone in an instant, his car crushed against the railings on a foggy mountain road. She remembered his voice as if he'd spoken to her just yesterday, and yet here it was, now, on the other end of the line. "This isn't funny," she said, her voice a mixture of anger and fear. But the voice continued, as if he hadn't heard her. "Why did you leave me, Em?" he asked, a hint of sorrow in his tone. "Why didn't you wait for me?" Emily's heart raced. This had to be some sort of prank. Someone was trying to mess with her, to make her relive the trauma of losing Jake. She clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing. "You're not real," she said, her voice shaking. "You can't be real." The voice on the other end paused, then laughed softly. "Emily, you were the one who promised you'd never forget me. I need you to remember. Come see me one last time." The line went dead. Emily tried to rationalize it, but she couldn't shake the voice from her mind. She felt compelled to follow the voice's call, to find out if it really was Jake. She'd never visited the site of his crash. It had always been too painful, but something told her that was exactly where she needed to go. She grabbed her keys and drove through the rain-soaked streets, the eerie quiet of the night filling her with a sense of foreboding. When she finally reached the winding road up the mountain, her headlights illuminated the twisted trees and slick asphalt. Her heart pounded as she neared the spot where Jake's car had gone off the road. The barriers had been repaired since the accident, but the tire marks were still visible, etched into the asphalt like scars. She parked, gripping the steering wheel tightly, and looked out into the darkness beyond the railing. She felt as if the forest itself was watching her, breathing around her in sync with the rain. Suddenly, her phone rang again. She didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. With a deep breath, she answered. "Emily," the voice whispered, softer this time, almost gentle. "I knew you'd come." What do you want?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. Her own breath fogged up the cold glass of the car window as she stared out into the rain-soaked forest. "I want you to remember," he said, a trace of sadness in his voice. "Do you remember what happened that night? Why I never made it home?" Emily's mind flashed back to the night of the accident. She'd been waiting for him, expecting him to arrive hours earlier. But the call from the police came instead, bringing her world crashing down. Jake, it wasn't my fault. I didn't make you drive out in that weather, she whispered, as if trying to convince herself as much as him. The voice sighed, heavy with sorrow. You didn't answer my calls, Em. I just wanted to hear your voice one last time. Emily's heart ached. Her phone had been on silent that night. She had missed his final calls. She closed her eyes, grief flooding her once more. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. But there was no response, only the faint sound of rain on the line. The call ended, and she was left with nothing but silence. She turned off the car and stepped out, the rain drenching her instantly. Standing there, staring into the dark forest, she whispered, I'm here, Jake. I'm listening. A faint light flickered in the woods, drawing her deeper into the shadows. She followed it, each step taking her further from the road. Her flashlight illuminated twisted branches and the occasional glint of something metallic among the leaves. Then, she saw it. Jake's car, or what was left of it, rusted and broken, half covered in vines. She couldn't understand how it was still there. The authorities had taken it away after the crash. She took a step closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the cold metal. Emily. She spun around, the voice now coming from behind her, louder, more distinct. There he stood, just as she remembered him. Dark hair, blue eyes, the same faint smile. But something was wrong. His eyes looked empty, hollow, as if he were more shadow than man. You came, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never meant to leave you, she replied, tears streaming down her face. He stepped closer, his face unreadable. Then stay with me, Em, just like you promised. She took a step back, fear overtaking her sorrow. Jake, I can't. Then why did you come here? His face twisted into something unrecognizable, a look of anger and betrayal. Before she could answer, the rain grew heavier, blurring her vision. The last thing she saw was Jake reaching out, his hand cold as death, pulling her into the shadows. Days later, Emily's car was found on the side of the road, but she was nowhere to be seen. Friends and family searched the mountain, but there was no trace of her. The only thing left was her phone, lying beside the road with a final voicemail from an unknown number. In it, a faint voice whispered her name, over and over, as the rain poured down in the background.